Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is day 161, Sunday, August the 13th, 2017. Thank you so much for tuning in again. What if the corporate media claims that the Russians were responsible for hacking the DNC were wrong? What if nobody noticed? What if the Attorney General had a secret meeting at an airport tarmac with the husband of the target of a criminal investigation who was to be questioned in less than 48 hours by the FBI? What if the people who suggested that there may be a crime and a cover-up were minimized, demonized, and criticized? What if we found out a year after the tarmac meeting that the AG's office and the head of the FBI were strategizing together on how to limit the damage and spin that meeting on the tarmac? What if DNC data analyst Seth Rich had a confrontation with Donna Brazile, his boss, over the unfair treatment of Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary? What if the DC Metro Police detectives didn't think it was important to interview Brazile and her boss, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, after Seth Rich's murder? What if Seth Rich's frustration led him to leak 44,000 emails to WikiLeaks? What if somebody found out? What if John Podesta's email about making an example out of the leaker became a self-fulfilling prophecy? What if somebody noticed? What if CrowdStrike, the company that the DNC brought in to analyze the DNC servers, concluded after only 24 hours that the DNC servers were hacked by the Russians? What if the owners of CrowdStrike were anti-Putin, anti-Trump, had connections to George Soros, anti-Russia organizations, the DNC, and Hillary Rodham Clinton? What if the district attorney in charge of the Seth Rich case was the brother of the head of the DNC, Debbie Wasserman Schultz? What if nobody ever questioned it? What if the DNC refused to allow the FBI and the DHS to examine their servers after they were allegedly hacked? What if the FBI and the DHS said, "Oh, okay"? What if the FBI and the intel agencies based their findings of Russia collusion solely on the findings of CrowdStrike? What if Congress and the media played along? What if CrowdStrike created the fake persona of Guccifer 2.0 as a vehicle to leak meaningless info and attribute it to WikiLeaks in an effort to discredit Julian Assange and WikiLeaks? What if someone called the Forensicator proved that they did? What if Guccifer 2.0 was accused of working for the Russians and being a Romanian, despite the fact that he cannot speak Russian or Romanian? What if Julian Assange told us that the DNC leaker was neither Russian nor acting for the Russian government, and the government media complex said that Assange was lying? What if GPS Fusion decided to link President Trump to WikiLeaks and begin a narrative of the Trump-Russian collusion? What if everyone went along with it, including the Republicans? What if Fusion GPS used Rob Goldstone to set up the meeting between Natalia Veselnitskaya, Trump Jr., Manafort, and Jared Kushner to feed the narrative and to provide the justification to launch surveillance on these three men? What if John Brennan, head of the CIA, told GPS to arrange that meeting? What if a Republican senator obtained a damaging dossier and gave it to the FBI director in an effort to bring down a president of his own party? What if no members of Congress seemed to care, Democrat or Republican? What if a U.S. ambassador to the UN and the National Security Advisor requested surveillance and unmasking of citizens of hundreds of times during an election year? What if no one seemed to notice? What if Hillary Rodham Clinton was found to have used an unprotected illegal private server to send and receive thousands of classified emails, including top secret SAP programs, and along with her husband ran a pay-to-play fake charity scheme known as the Clinton Foundation, and nobody thought a special counsel was warranted? What if the AG and the FBI covered up the crime? What if the acting AG decided that a fake Russian narrative based on hearsay examination of the DNC servers and a discredited dossier did warrant the appointment of a special counsel? What if the acting AG suggested the president fire the FBI director for his mishandling of the Clinton email investigation and low morale at the FBI? What if the president followed the AG's advice, his suggestion, and fired the FBI director? What if the acting attorney general then launched a special counsel to investigate the president for taking his advice and firing the FBI director? What if Republicans in Congress cheered him on? What if former CIA Director John Brennan publicly called for a coup d'etat against the president? What if Brennan did so just a week ago? What if John Brennan, former head of the CIA, was the source for Christopher Steele's dossier? What if Christopher Steele didn't even know? What if Imran Awan had access to the DNC network? What if no one cared? What if Imran Awan has blackmail material on Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Donna Brazile, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and other heads of the Clinton campaign and the DNC? What if Imran Awan has information about Seth Rich? What if the Russian-Trump collusion narrative is proven 100% untrue? What if people find out? What if the collusion was on behalf of the establishment politicians, the corrupt media, the intelligence community, the big banks, and the deep state? What if people found out and they did care? What if the truth revealed that the whole story was a covert political operation to bring down the president and a deep state coup? What if the people were informed? What would they do? Just some questions. I have a lot of questions. Food for thought. Well, so the big story that everyone is talking about is, of course, the riots that broke out in Virginia. And, of course, the 19 or so, last number I heard, who were injured and one killed, including now it appears a police helicopter crashed and 2 individuals killed in that crash. We don't know what brought the helicopter down at this point. Probably it's a helicopter. I logged in 1,500 hours flying in helicopters. Flying egg beaters, death traps. I remember many, many times sitting there on the edge of my seat with that belt strapped in as I leaned over and looked out. I was ready to jump, my friends. I wasn't going down with the ship. I was just damn hoping it wouldn't fall down on top of me after I leapt out. I may have broke both my legs, but I wasn't going to go down in a fiery heap, I can assure you that. They're death traps. The Army would never report how many helicopter crashes happened and how many people were lost in helicopter crashes and things. They're not very stable vehicles, and when you watch the pilots flying these, they have to use both of their feet, these big long pedals, controlling the blades. You have two guys working both hands and both feet, and there's a lot that can go wrong. Most of the helicopters we were flying were made in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They just keep repairing them over and over again. They remind me of old 1960s and 70s cars that would constantly have to be repaired. Not like the cars of today, which you can drive 100,000 miles without even changing the oil. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. My thoughts on what happened in Virginia. Well, there's a lot of things going on here. First, I would like to say that I think President Trump made exactly the correct statement. I think it had enough bite in it, and I think it was also measured. There's a lot of people criticizing him because he did not come out and specifically identify the right-wing group in this case. I don't really consider them a right-wing group. I don't know about left-wing, right-wing. We like to use these terms left and right, left-wing, right-wing, so that we can attach them to one of the two political parties or ideas of thought. But this is a flawed analogy because 99.9999% of Democrats, 99.999% of Republicans, left or right, would never be a part of or support the type of things that we see from these extremely fringe groups. Extreme fringe groups, I should say. A lot of people calling for civil war or thinking this is saying this is going to be civil war, and I'm very disappointed in some of my fellow YouTubers who are out there running that line. I'm sure they're getting a lot of clicks. This will not lead to a civil war. Trust me. For two reasons. Two main ones, many more minor reasons, but two major reasons why this event in Virginia will not lead to a civil war. Number one, the people involved represent such a microscopic percentage of 1% of the overall population in the country that there simply aren't enough of them to bring that kind of that level of violence or activity or what have you. There's just not enough of them. They're a very small group. It was 600 people there, and this was an organized event, planned event. Then they had the people on the other side, maybe equal number. Very, very, very tiny, tiny, tiny number of people we're talking about. When you look at the group that's labeled at the far left, the left, that would be the Antifa group. They make up such a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage that they're a nuisance. They're like a mosquito buzzing around your head. The same is true of the white supremacists on the right, the neo-Nazis, KKK. We have the KKK. They do their once or twice a year thing down here in Cincinnati, down on Fountain Square. They're lucky to get 200 people there. This is an event that they plan for 6 months or a year. They can only get 200 people there. There just simply aren't enough of these people who are in these extremes that it would lead to any type of a major civil uprising that would spread across the country. It's just not going to happen unless the response by the government was too heavy-handed. Then you may see them both turn on the government. But as far as this leading to this civil war or whatever, we're not there yet. I do believe at some point in the future that you will see a breakup of the United States, but I believe we're talking at the least 100 years, maybe 200 years, maybe 300 years, maybe 1,000 years. It's a long way off. But eventually, if you follow the trends of history, you could see the United States break up into 4 or 5 big chunks at some time in the future, but we'll all be long gone from this terrestrial plane before that happens. Let's see. The original thing that seemed to cause this uprising was the removal of the Robert E. Lee monument. I am opposed to removing historical monuments, regardless of what they represent, because they are historical monuments. They represent a time in history. We shouldn't be trying to remove our history because we can't. It happened. We know it happened. We know what our history is. We have a lot of good history. We have a lot of bad history. We should be able to reflect reasonably and intelligently on both. One person should look at a Robert E. Lee statue and go, yep, that was the good general. He led the fight. Another person may look at that and go, that was a horrible racist pig. I'm glad he lost. However you choose to view that historical monument, it is a historical monument. It tells us something about that time in history that we should not forget. We need to understand and respect these monuments from our history, whether they are good or bad. You can't erase the past. You can only correct what is wrong and try to move forward into the future and improve. And we have, and we do all the time. You know, I remember the 1960s very well. People who are talking about how bad things are now have no clue. Either they weren't alive in the 60s or they were so stoned they can't remember what happened. I wasn't stoned. I was a child, but I remember it very well. For 2 weeks, I remember for 2 weeks, they closed the schools. They closed everything, businesses and everything. We had the National Guard on the streets. This occurred because they began busing white students and black students to different schools. During the 60s, there were massive protests, tens of thousands of people around the White House every day, nonstop, almost throughout the 60s. We had the civil rights marches. We had women's rights marches. We had the backdrop of the Vietnam War, a very unpopular war, which was splitting and dividing and ripping the country apart. We had a lot of racism. We had a lot of bad things that were airing themselves out in front of the TV cameras. We had the assassinations of the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, many others. We had the bombings of police stations, bombings of abortion clinics, bombings of civil, the buildings where various groups would meet, things like that. Lots of bombings. There were very violent, mature groups of people like the Black Panthers and others like them. Many, many groups. The 60s were very violent. There was much more social unrest than we see today on a much, much larger scale. These Antifa groups and the neo-Nazis or alt-right wing or whatever you want to call these people, however you want to label them, they pale in comparison to the level of civil unrest and the numbers of people participating that we saw back in the 60s. And despite the fact, you know when you go to these types of rallies, you are taking some risk. Certainly violence can break out in these types of things, and there is a risk to doing it. When you attend these types of rallies, you have to watch yourself, be careful, pay attention to what's going on around you. Violence can break out. People can be injured or killed. It happens. It's always happened since the beginning of democracy, because that's what democracy does. It allows people the freedom to go out publicly and state exactly what's on their mind, as ugly as it may be. That's why we have the First Amendment, to protect ugly speech and activities, not to protect pretty nice speech. We don't need a First Amendment protection to keep us all from wishing each other a good morning or a good day. No, it's there for the people who would put the finger in our face or shout us down. It's not there, however, to allow people to engage in violent acts. There doesn't need to be any violence. The violence occurs when one side realizes they're losing, that their particular belief or whatever it is that they're pushing ain't selling. Their frustration leads them to act out in violence. If they can't get you, persuade you to follow them, they'll beat on you until you do. These people represent a very, very tiny percentage of 1% of people in the country, and that's why you need not worry. Sleep well, my friends. This is not going to lead to anything much larger than what it is now. And also the second reason, which I didn't mention, which I'll mention now, is the government has adequate, more than adequate enough of force that they can bring into play to put these types of things down, and they will. You will not see these types of things in communist countries or in dictatorships and brutal regimes like in North Korea, you won't see a protest in North Korea. You certainly won't. You wouldn't have seen it in the old Soviet Union. You won't see it down in Cuba. And when you see it in Venezuela, you see what happens. The dictator sends someone out and just says, shoot him. So, in a way, while it is ugly to see it play itself out, especially on TV and things like that, it is better than having it go underground. So it's part of living in a democracy. It's part of having a free speech. Sometimes things will get out of hand. And there's enough blame to go around. But the largest finger of blame should be pointed at two particular groups who've always been with us and who've always been participants. The number one person I fault is the media. I can assure you that in newsrooms in Los Angeles and New York yesterday, they were giddy at seeing these demonstrations. They were hoping for violence, and they got really, really thrilled when they heard that one person had been killed. It's good for the ratings. They've been the single largest propagators of this race baiting and of building this racial tension. This is what they do. We also know that, as with all these groups throughout all these generations, whether it was the 1960s, the 1930s, the 1860s, the 1820s, or the 1750s, we know that there are always people with money, power, and influence who a lot of times are behind these groups. People like George Soros. This is exactly what we see him doing in Europe, in North Africa, and here in the United States. He's behind the Black Lives Matter. A lot of the money that funds these people, we know, are being paid through George Soros-funded organizations. You see, to a globalist like George Soros, who wants to bring in the global world order, they understand that you cannot bring in the new world order unless you break down the old world order. You must destroy all religions, social norms, preferably destroy economies. You must propagate a lot of violent thought and activity. You can be assured that there are powerful forces driving probably both sides of this violence that you saw in Virginia. True, some of it is organic, it is real, some of it. But you'll find that a lot of the violence happens and the agent provocateurs occur when the people who are being paid, the professionals, are on scene. That's when you see the stuff get ugly, usually. It should also be noted that the FBI, as soon as any group pops up on the radar screen of the FBI, they are infiltrated immediately. You can bet that the FBI has a dossier on Antifa, on any of these white supremacist groups, white nationalist groups. They have a dossier on these people. They have pictures, they have photos, they have information on individuals who participate in these events, particularly the leaders of these events. They are watched very closely. They are generally infiltrated. Unfortunately, as part of this infiltration, sometimes rogue elements of these agencies can be co-opted by people like Soros and others. We've seen this throughout American history. What we are witnessing here in this particular year is very similar and no different, really, than what we've seen throughout our history and in the history of most Western democracies. It's part of living in a democracy. You have a lot of powerful forces who have agendas. You also have people in all democratic forms of government who are going to be those people that slip through the cracks. That small percentage, that less than 1% crowd, the small percentage of even 1% can make a lot of noise. And of course, again, they are supported largely and motivated and propagated by the media. If you want to point the finger of blame at anyone specifically more than anyone else, I would blame the media. They love this stuff. We saw how they reacted during the Black Lives Matter riots in Missouri back in the previous summer. We can see how they always react, and they feed this stuff. They feed the fuel to the fire. They are not our friends. They are not interested in bringing people together, working out any of the issues. They are interested in ratings. They are interested especially in using events like this as political tools to assault the president, to attack the president. And I assume that that's what a lot of this is about. So that would be pretty much my thoughts on what I see happening in Virginia. It'll happen again. These types of things will continue. They've always been there and they always will be there. You will not find a decade in American history where there weren't civil unrest, uprisings, various types of rebellions, mini revolutions, and things and such. It's just a part of our history. It always will be, as with any functioning democracy. But again, it's far better than having it underground. So it does make people stop and think in a way. It kind of serves in a way, it does a service in a way, because it makes a lot of people think about it. They look at it and they say, man, I don't want that happening in my community. They go to work the next day where they probably work around people who are white, black, Latino, African, whatever, and maybe they're a little nicer than normal. Maybe they try to go out of their way a little more, and because they have this idea in their mind. So, you know, there can be something good that can come out of these things, but what you won't see is large numbers of people signing up to be a part of either of these two groups. The majority of people are going to look at these people and say, man, that's ugly. I don't want to be a part of that. I do not want my political party to be associated with that. One important thing Donald Trump said that the media obviously missed, and that really should be a function of journalists and the media, is Donald Trump said we need to study this. He's exactly right, and I think I know what he meant by that. He meant it on a couple different levels. Certainly he understands that there are nefarious forces, many of them aligned against him, who are the propagators of this. He also understands the role that the media plays, and he knows why. He didn't get specific on that, but I think he knows that there are those of us who are out here who understand exactly what he's talking about. And this is what the real journalist would actually do if they were real journalists. They would look into the situation and find out who these people are, what is motivating them, who may be involved in pumping money or resources into this particular situation to inflame it and hope it spreads. You only need to look at the color revolutions that have been going on now for 7-8 years in Europe and North Africa. We know who's behind them. We know who is behind the putsch in Ukraine. We know who is behind a lot of the uprisings in Muslim countries in North Africa. His name is George Soros. He has a lot of friends here in the intelligence community and in the United States and in the Western world. He has good friends like John McCain. He has good friends like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and many Republicans too. So there's what we see on the surface, and then there's what lies beneath. Both of them need to be evaluated and studied, as the president said. And I think when you do that, I think that you will find the truth if you are interested in getting it. That would not be something we can expect from the mainstream media. They will only use this as a vehicle to attack the president. They're not interested in what's really fueling this. And if they did get down to the business of a serious piece of investigative journalism to find out what was really fueling a lot of this, they would find out that it was them. So this is nothing to get terribly worked up about. It's unfortunate there have been injuries and a death. In fact, now the deaths of the cops who were on the helicopter. It's unfortunate, but it's America. It's democracy. It's how things work. It's how they've always worked. It's how they will always work. But what you hope for is that the overwhelming majority of people will not be sucked into these extremist groups through their ignorance, sometimes through their own laziness, and sometimes just for looking for something to do. The overwhelming majority of people in this country and around the Western world are not radical to the extent of these people that we see in Antifa or white supremacists or anything like that. They do not represent the views of 99.9% of the people, and 99.9% of the people realize that. If not for the media and various rogue players like Mr. Soros and his friends, these things wouldn't get out of hand as they do. No real truth will come from the media. The president will probably appoint some sort of a commission to look into it. They'll probably have some findings. But ultimately, I don't think there's much new to learn from this. And we probably do need to have a serious debate about how we handle these events, these situations when people call for the removal of these historic monuments. If you want to get a big fight started, that's exactly the type of thing that you do. And the people who started that should have known that. In fact, they did know that. These are the people who we should be focusing on. These are the people we should be educating. You cannot change history. You cannot change and undo the past. What you do is you look at that history, you admit what the problems were, you try to study them and understand them, and you try to move forward and do better. We do not live in a perfect world made up of perfect beings. We live in a world of flawed beings. Everyone flawed to some degree or another. So each individual does his best every day to try to improve himself or herself. You learn from your mistakes. You correct the problems as best you can to the degree that you can, and you move forward. You don't dwell on the past. You can't go and blame somebody for what 2 or 3 generations before did. You cannot do these things. It only stirs up the pot, gets you nowhere, produces nothing but more violence, more poverty, more suffering, more confusion, more ignorance. And as I said in a previous video, the more you get, the more you get. So that's my thoughts on what happened in Virginia. And it will not be the last one of these events. But to those fellow YouTubers of mine, I'm very disappointed in those of you who are out working to get that clickbait, predicting civil war, and that these things are going to spread across the country. They're not, because there simply aren't that many people who support either of those extreme views, left or right. It simply isn't going to happen. It's not who we are. We have a history of that as well. And it's all very well documented if you want to read it, if you want to learn it, understand it. So that's my thoughts for today. What if TowerGate, day 161, August 13th, 2017. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Enjoy your Sunday evening. I'll be back tomorrow with more breaking news. Thank you for tuning in. See you guys. Be well.